Hello and welcome to Fermentation Fact Friday. My name is Austin Durant, founder of Fermenters Club, and this is a new series I'm starting on my channel. And hopefully every week we can answer one of your burning questions about food fermentation. So let's get started. So I get a lot of questions when I teach my workshops, and one of the ones that people ask is, well, once I make whatever it is, let's say kimchi or kombucha or sourdough bread, how long do those things last once they've been fermented? So I decided to do an episode dedicated to answering that question. First of all, just wanted to talk a little bit about Fermenters Club. We've got free tips and recipes on our website, fermentersclub.com, various ways for you to learn, whether that be online self-paced classes at Fermenters Club Academy. We also have limited amounts of things like sourdough cultures, kefir cultures, etc., available shipping throughout the United States, as well as one-on-one coaching, private team building, exercises, workshops, etc. Lots of different great stuff related to fermentation, as well as a book I published in late 2024 called Fearless Fermenting. All right, we got my not so shameless plugs out of the way. Let's get to it. So the simple answer is a long time, and that's because fermentation has always been a way to extend the shelf life of fresh food. And so the means in which we do that, whether that's through salt or a culture, is there to extend the life of food. So by their nature, fermented foods are long-lived. But the more nuanced answer would be, it depends. And this is based on a lot of factors like what it is you've been fermenting, the storage conditions that you're keeping the thing, the temperature in the storage condition, and also the nature of the food itself, whether it's more perishable, whether it's protein-based, whether it's vegetable-based, carbohydrates, etc., as well as your personal taste. So what one person might think of as too far gone, the other person might think of as perfectly, edible. So a lot of it is relative to your own tastes. So here are some of the factors that contribute to the shelf life of fermented foods. Of course, temperature. Now I like to say the refrigerator is a time machine, or rather a super slow-mo button. If you remember the old VCRs, you could scan them down to super slow-mo. I guess in today's world it would be 0.25 on your YouTube. The temperatures that are in refrigerators really retard the activity of fermentation. It doesn't kill the microbes, which is important because we still want to enjoy the probiotic benefits, but it does slow it down significantly enough to basically pause it or make it extremely slow. Now, if you've got another cool storage place like a root cellar, this is also a great place in which to store fermented foods that will extend their shelf life. Another factor, of course, is how long the item itself was fermented. And there actually is a microbial succession, which I'll go into in a little bit here, during fermentation. Now what happens is after about maybe 14 to 30 days, again, it really depends on what we're fermenting, the microbial activity tends to stabilize, and at some point it will decline. Now that's just a fact to throw in there when we're thinking about how long fermented foods persist. Now, the fact that the microbes themselves may stabilize or decline doesn't necessarily correlate to its shelf life. And that's because the byproducts that these fermentation microbes have created are things like acids, which are preservative of themselves. So I'll show you that interesting study in a little bit. How much salt is used in fermentation? I'll talk more about that. Salt is a microbial inhibitor. So it actually works to sort of allow certain microbes in and keep certain microbes out. So if you know this in advance and you want to plan a long ferment, for example, you could actually use more salt, and that will will slow down the fermentation, and also that has the effect of extending the shelf life. And like I said, the nature of the ferment itself, whether it's something as volatile as milk, or maybe beans, which have protein, or vegetables. And again, like I said, how it's stored. So this is an interesting study that was done. I think it was University of Wisconsin, way back almost 30 years ago, and they basically measured the amount of microbes visible in sauerkraut, and that is during the fermentation process. So it's a little bit of an eye chart here, but I'm sure you can pause and check it out. Basically, it shows that on the top chart here, the various types of microorganisms and how they proliferate and what happens after a certain amount of time. So what you can see here is, let's take, for example, LAB, which stands for lactobacillus, which is the very common genus of microbes that do the fermentation. So you can kind of see, and this is along this axis here is the number of days of fermentation. So right around from day 0 to day 5, you can see in the green bar here, it jumps up quite a bit. And then after about 10 days to 14 days, it sort of levels off. And then between 14 and 30 days of fermentation, it starts to decline. And this is kind of the trend of the other microbes involved as well. You can kind of see the gram-negative, which would be sort of what are considered the coliform bacteria or round-shaped bacteria. They sort of get the party started, and then within about 5 or 10 days, they drop to basically nothing. And then leuconostics kind of in the middle. So they will, you can kind of see the chart in there in red. Anyway, point is different microbes will start, take the baton, so to speak, and then finish the succession. But you can kind of see even after 30 days, there's still a decent amount. So that's just to show you, again, within about 30 days or so, what the succession is. Again, this is just sauerkraut. So each different ferment will have its own bacterial or sometimes yeast ecosystem and might look different, but just to give you an idea. So this is a classic study. I'll link to the study. It's still there from the 1998 HTML. You'll get it's a good throwback. And this is just another sample that same group did, just to show you kind of similar patterns. And the other the graph down below is actually the amount of lactic acid that's generated. And again, that's one of the byproducts that these microbes create, and it has a preservative effect. So you can kind of see, based on the various critters that are in here, after about, the lactic acid percentage goes up and it almost levels off, but you can kind of see it still steadily increases all the way up until 35 days into fermentation, which again, lactic acid is a preservative and will help keep your ferment going. All right, let's see. So how to tell when a ferment has gone bad? And again, bad is in relative terms. For people who can tolerate really sour or like it really funky, bad might be different than somebody who might be just getting started. But that said, there are classic ways you can find out. If in your refrigerator, for example, you've got sauerkraut or pickles, probably not pickles, but like sauerkraut or kimchi, that's just completely dried out, doesn't have any liquid in it, then that is potential for getting mold. And so I would say if a jar is completely dried out, it's probably past its shelf life. Another thing is you'll notice that textural changes happen, again, with things like vegetables. So kimchi or sauerkraut might just get really soft. Now those acids that I talked about are not going to go away, but again, it could get really sour beyond what you might want to put in your palate. Also, it might be too soft to really enjoy as food. So we'll talk about what you can do with that. If it's gotten too soft, for example, with kimchi. If it's got a really foul odor, something may have gotten in there, even post-fermentation. This can happen. Not very often, but can happen. And if there's mold or something that's fuzzy and just not supposed to be there, that it really has engulfed most of your ferment, again, that's another sign it's probably gone bad. Of course, if you see little bugs flying around in there or crawling around, because it's usually the insects like to lay their eggs and the larvae hatch and all that stuff. It's pretty gross if you're not into that sort of thing. So if insects have infested your ferment, I think it's gone bad. Now again, this is all relative. I was just listening to a podcast from where one of the cheese guys, Trevor Warmerdal, I believe is his name, was saying he travels around the world looking for cheeses, and he found the one that's in Sardinia, and they specifically wait for certain flies to land and hatch their eggs, and this is very, they're eating the cheese along with the maggots. So again, this is all relative. But generally, if insects have infested, let's say your kombucha SCOBY or vegetables, probably time to get rid of it. Or if you just don't want to eat it, this is where I like to say, trust your senses. If something just doesn't appeal to you, don't override your senses just because you're like, oh, this is exotic, it should be fun, and I should enjoy it. If your body is like, no, we don't want to consume that, honor that. So just, it's always just a good rule to follow when we're talking about fermentation. Now, how can we extend the shelf life of your ferments? Alluded to before some of the factors that influenced it. So let's talk about how to employ those factors and employ that knowledge. So again, keep things cool. The refrigerator is a fermentation slow-mo device. It slows fermentation down to basically essentially stopped, not truly stopped, but it basically will extend the shelf life versus if you left that ferment out at room temperature. Now again, if you've got a cool root cellar or something, even a cool room, your fermentation with, say, vegetables is perfectly safe. However, it will last longer because we're slowing the microbial process down if we store it in a cool environment like the fridge. Another thing you want to do is minimize the airflow once the ferment is finished. So again, this has to do with things like vegetables. So that means use tight lidded jars or containers if you're storing them in the refrigerator, and that will minimize the drying out, as well as the potential for things, airborne microbes like yeasts and molds, to come to the party, because we don't want them there. So minimizing the airflow, keeping your jars clean on the insides as well. So if you've got like sauerkraut and you're enjoying it, just make sure to wipe down or scrape down the insides of that jar, because if you've got little pieces of vegetable stuck to the sides of the jar that is exposed to the air, that can tend to, again, potentially attract or harbor microbes. So keeping everything clean, level surface, and everything under the brine post-fermentation will help extend the shelf life. Another technique you can employ is to really ferment larger sized pieces. Now what I mean by that is, let's say we've got sauerkraut, which is shredded, versus a whole cabbage. So the reason is all about surface area. So if we expose less surface area to the environment, then the chance for more microbes to show up is lower. So that said, whether we're talking maybe chunks of things like beets versus shredded beets, it's all about the surface area. So this is going to affect not only the fermentation rate, but post-fermentation, how long that ferment will last. So a whole cabbage that you ferment, you got to dunk it in brine, will arguably last a little bit longer than the same amount of cabbage that's been shredded. And again, this just has to do with how many microbes are allowed, how much is exposed to the environment. And then, as I alluded to before, salt is a microbial inhibitor. So if you are planning a longer ferment, or if you want something to last longer, and you can think of this ahead of time, then add more salt. So an example would be if you are making miso. If you are wanting to do a longer miso, you can add a little bit more salt, knowing that maybe you're going to ferment it for 1 or 2 years, versus a shorter miso, which maybe you're going to harvest later in the year. Right now it's early spring, so you could put up you could put up miso jar and then harvest it in 6 months. Again, you could adjust the amount of salt a little bit downward, knowing that you're going to harvest it in about 6 months. Just one example. Now, well, let's say you've gotten somewhere, you've found your jar, you're like, you made the call, I'm just not going to consume this. What can I do with it? So one thing you can do, if we're talking about things like vegetables, like say kimchi or pickles or sauerkraut, is if the solid part, meaning the vegetable itself, is too unappetizing, the brine might still be very useful. In fact, I look forward to this when I finish whatever I'm eating. The brine that's left, it's rich, it's full of flavor, it's got a lot of salt, it's got a lot of acids. So I think of it like vinegar. So I will often bottle my brines, move them from a jar into a bottle, and then just use them for cooking. So I've got excess kimchi brine. I'll just throw that in with a little bit of broth, whether I'm making a soup or whether I'm making a stir fry, and it really just delivers a lot of flavor. Now keep in mind that cooking probiotic-rich foods or liquids like that will tend to kill them, because that's why one of the reasons why we cook food is to get rid of the bad bacteria, but heat destroys probiotic content. But again, by that point, we've already used and utilized a lot of the probiotic-rich content, and we're just availing ourselves of the other parts, like the saltiness and the flavor. So those still, of course, usually survive cooking. So again, let's say another example would be kombucha. If I somehow don't get to drinking all of my kombucha while it's still nice and sweet, it'll essentially continue to ferment until it becomes vinegar, at which point, again, I think of it like vinegar. So in fact, I even have a separate container that I take overripe kombucha in, separate from my normal active kombucha fermentation, and then I specifically create more vinegar from it. Never have to buy apple cider vinegar again, because I'm basically replaced that with kombucha vinegar. And if something just gets super funky and it gets a bunch of mold on it, you can always just compost it or bury it. If you don't have a compost pile, barring that, you can wash it down the sink. Just be careful if you're dealing with something that's moldy. You'll often see a lot of the mold spores themselves just sort of like proliferate. So if you're sensitive to that, just be careful. Be mindful as you're either throwing it away or washing it down the sink. And then all else fails, you don't have any of those, you can throw it into the trash. And here's a chart I made of, again, sort of encapsulating, for the most common ferments, what I consider to be the shelf life, usually in the refrigerator. And I've got some comments here, so I'll let you enjoy that. See if there's anything notable here. So again, yeah, kimchi, sauerkrauts, your vegetable ferments tend to be really long-lived. Can be several months in the refrigerator. And again, things like cucumber pickles might start to wane in terms of their crispness, and at which point you can turn it into relish if you want. I've got a recipe for that on the website. So yeah, kombucha is about a month. However, when we're talking about certain flavors, I find certain flavors, especially summertime flavors like watermelon or strawberry, tend to be more ephemeral, meaning like you want to drink those within maybe 2 weeks, 1 or 2 weeks. Some other flavors, berries that, for example, tend to hold up longer in the refrigerator. Let's see, let's see, hot sauces though, for example, I've had for many years. I even do keep those at room temperature, because in my style, I like to ferment my hot sauce or my peppers for 6 or 8 months. So they're really getting a lot of salt, a lot of acids built up. So they tend to be fine even at room temperature. But again, to extend the shelf life even more, move them to the refrigerator. And misos, I say, are essentially unlimited. Again, it depends on how you store them. Miso can easily last 10 years. In fact, I was just looking through my old miso collection here, and I found a miso that was from November of 2015. So this is over 10 years old. And I looked at it just to make sure it's still not too funky. And it is perfectly edible. Smells amazing, as it has over the last, like I said, 10 years. So again, miso is especially salty, so it will live a very long time in your refrigerator. So just good to know. All right, well, I hope you found this frequently asked question helpful, and we provided some information. Once again, you can find all the good stuff here on our YouTube channel. So please remember to like, subscribe to our channel, and share this if you found it helpful. And again, all of the resources available for free at Fermenters Club, recipes, tips, You can get a copy of my book. You can pick up some live cultures, etc., etc. So thanks for joining me today, and I will see you guys next week for another installment of Fermentation Fact Fridays. Cheers.